Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child through the method of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecchi Lozano. Today we have Chip DeLorenzo, who is the co-author of the book Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom, and his wife, Kathleen, who is a Level I CGS catechist and a Montessori guide, on the podcast to tell us how they became involved in both catechesis of the Good Shepherd and positive discipline. They explore with us the connections between positive discipline and the Montessori philosophy, and they also offer some practical tools that we can use to help maintain freedom and limits in our work with children in the atrium. I hope you enjoy. Chip and Kathleen, welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
I'm so excited. I've been so excited for months for this conversation. So I'm really grateful to you both for agreeing to be a part of this project with us. I would love it if y'all would share a little bit about yourselves. Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get involved in catechesis of the Good Shepherd?
Why don't you go first, Kath?
Okay. So I've been a Montessori teacher for quite some time and also involved in youth ministry and teaching catechism at different parishes and stuff. And I was always, felt like those other programs were lacking something. I was never pleased with how I did it or, what I was given to do. And then when I found out there was sort of a Montessori inspired one, I was completely excited. And it wasn't until 12 years into being in Montessori that I was able to take the training. And I just loved it. I was so grateful for it. So that's how I got involved. We didn't have it in our parish, and so I was able to build it. And that's a great experience, being able to build an atrium, especially when you're starting out. And yeah, I've just loved it ever since. And now in Cincinnati, there is a richness of CGS here, and that is totally inspiring and really transformed the way I even approach Montessori philosophy and everything.
That's neat. So you're saying your CGS formation formed you in your Montessori work. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, it definitely enriched it. Just a deeper engagement with the philosophy and, the training I had for Montessori, I'm so grateful for it, was very precise and very beautiful as well, and then just to add the explicitness of the spirituality, I think in secular Montessori, people tend to glaze it because they're afraid of it and they're afraid of turning people away and from the Montessori philosophy, but CGS embraces it in such a great way. And I've found, even in a non-sectarian classroom, the children are starving for that spirituality to be addressed,
Yeah.
And I found it through Kathy. We were Catholic, and we both had worked in secular Montessori schools for most of our career, and Kathy was started to do CGS. Watching her work in the classroom, it really just opened everything up for me. I seen the kids really flourish in an environment that I wish we could have put in our school at the time, but it was a secular school and in a small area in rural Maine, so we weren't able to. There wasn't the population to do that. And so, coming here in an area where there are far more Catholics and CGSs, it's all over the place. And there are Catholic Montessori schools around. And this one of the interesting things of my work in positive discipline over the last few years is that is the ability to kind of, through God's grace, bump into and work with Catholic Montessori schools where the atriums are actually built right into the schools and the classrooms. It's been really fun to see that grow here in the United States.
Yeah, it is really neat. There is a lot of growth. So tell us more about your work with positive discipline. How did that come about? So
I think the shortest answer is that I was flailing as a new teacher, as a new Montessori teacher, and I had a mentor who took notice. She's my boss, so of course she would take notice. And she, in a nice, kind, and firm way, as we do in positive discipline, said, "Hey, I think you ought to take a look into some of Jane Nelson's work on positive discipline." I used to see her and other veteran teachers handle situations with misbehavior and just, disruption with just absolute grace. It looked like, I'm a baseball fan, so it looked like Willie Mays making a basket catch in the outfield, like with no effort whatsoever. But for me, it just felt like I was carrying around a backpack with 2 tons of rocks in it. And so it looked like what they were doing was magic. And so when she suggested some of Jane Nelson's work, she didn't have to tell me twice, because I was really underwater with what I was experiencing as a new teacher in a Montessori classroom. And what happened for me was really truly transformational. I always said that if I had continued on the path that I was on, I would have likely burned out of teaching within about 2 to 3 years. And to be honest with you, I've never seen a teacher burn out because they didn't know how to present a Montessori lesson or, didn't understand the philosophy. I have seen many teachers burn out because they just didn't know how to navigate this environment where there is freedom within limits, and act discipline in an environment which most of us didn't really grow up in. And it's counter to what we've experienced. And so that's how I found it. And it allowed me to stay being a teacher, and it eventually allowed me to help other teachers. And Kath, I'll let you speak to your story.
Yeah, so with Positive Discipline, I actually took Chip's training before I knew him very well. And I remember listening to the Positive Discipline training thinking, this guy's got to be Christian. And it turned out he was, but the just like Montessori and Positive Discipline is the same way. It is essentially Christian, essentially Catholic, because of the respect it has for the individual, the spirituality component, looking at your own faults first, and how you can approach someone with respect and love and wanting the best for them. So I was really inspired the first time I took Positive Discipline. I didn't buy into it 100% right away, but I've come around.
Yeah.
It might be part of the marital promises, right? That you come around to agree with this.
And there's so much misunderstanding about what it is. As a matter of fact, Jane, in a conversation with her a few years ago, said, I wonder if we should have called it Positive Discipline, because I think everybody thinks it means that we're just rewarding children all day, and overlooking the fact that the word discipline, which comes from the Latin root disciplinare, right, which means to teach and to learn.
Yeah. I could see, though, how people who, before they understand the philosophy behind it, might be a little misunderstood. But I agree that when you understand, like what you just said, what discipline actually means, it's part of that rewriting the definition in your head that needs to happen whenever you embrace positive discipline, then that name makes complete sense.
Yeah, and a lot of us didn't grow up with these principles that we'll talk about.
Yeah. So again, it takes a whole nother rewriting, because you revert back to what you've always known, especially in times of stress. So, but I really agree with you of what you said about the burnout of the Montessori guide. I think it's the exact same with the CGS catechist and also the parent, because you go from your CGS formation, which is so amazing and beautiful and fruitful and peaceful, into a classroom with 13 3 to 6-year-olds, and you ask yourself, wait, this is not happening the way I thought it was, and you feel like you're the failure. And so I think there's a lot of catechist burnout and turnover rate, even though you've invested 90 plus hours into formation, specifically because of this. It doesn't, like you said, it's not because they can't give presentations. It's because the balance between freedom and limits is they don't know how to maintain that. And I feel like positive discipline is the missing tool for our tool bags on the how do I manage that space with them in a respectful, firm, but kind way. And so I'm so grateful for Jane's work and your work that gives us that tool.
Yeah, I'm grateful for it too, because I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here right now.
Would y'all speak into the characteristics that parallel between positive discipline and Montessori, therefore also catechesis of the Good Shepherd?
Sure. So I think we started off talking about that Montessori's environment is meant to have freedom within limits. And that's all, that's also wildly, I would say, misunderstood and misinterpreted by a lot of people. And I think it depends on our upbringing and how we perceive what that actually means. But, with freedom within limits, some people will interpret that as the adult just sitting on the edge of the room, and magically the children, because they have all this freedom, will follow their bliss, and they will, magically become normalized after a few lessons. And then other folks focus in on the limits part of it, which is that this, these very precise lessons in this very orderly environment. And I think they both parts of those, that the philosophy appeal to different people for different reasons. And it's really easy to be too heavy on one and not the other. But to be honest with you, it's, freedom within limits. You can't, it's systemic. You can't have one without the other. In positive discipline, we use the terminology, when we're talking about discipline, to say, kindness, which is part of that is freedom. And then the other piece is firmness, which is the responsibility. And you can't have freedom without real responsibility. And you can't have true responsibility without freedom. And both of those things need to be in place. And I would say that is the essence of positive discipline, where the adult is both kind, where they're expressing love and trust and respect for the child. But that part of that respect includes the fact of respecting their development, that they also need firmness. They need clarity, consistency, follow through, and high expectations, as well as the kindness and support to actually, to thrive. And that's the idea behind freedom within limits. And if I was going to give an elevator speech on what positive discipline is and how it connects with Montessori, it would just be kindness and firmness and freedom within limits, both at the same time. And I've never spoken to an audience where someone has said, I mean, literally never, I don't know about this whole kindness and firmness at the same time. I don't think that makes any sense. But I've, spoken to lots of people and felt the same way myself, which is, how on earth do you do that? And Kath, you want to talk maybe a little bit about how that ripples into the atrium? Sure.
I think there's some unique challenges to working in the atrium versus the Montessori classroom for sure. Some of them are, you have a shared space with other catechists and other classes. And then you have, once a week, possibly 2 hours a week, if you're lucky. And there's lots of pressure to change that to, I've heard of people doing it every other week, or shortened amounts of time or lengthened amount of time. And so there's a lot of challenges to the atrium that don't exist in the Montessori classroom. So some of those things are knocking up against your ability to address the needs of each particular child, which is, you have lots of time and lots of space to do it in a Montessori room. But I think going back to those principles of trusting the child and knowing that they want to thrive in this environment, and then being well practiced, sort of. So your atrium, where things are, how things are going to go when you present a lesson or when the child takes it out. And all those things that Chip is talking about, being present, warm, and silent, is what will propel the children. And also recognizing that they won't know all the time what are the rules. I love that story where Dr. Montessori goes in and she presents a lesson to the group of children on how to blow their nose, and they all clap for her at the end. And she just realizes they didn't know, and they want to be dignified, and they want to know. So that's a lot of where kind of the limits come in, where you realize you have a responsibility to inform them of these things, but also giving them the chance to follow through, giving them the chance to remember. So one of the things Chip and I always tell assistants, and remind ourselves constantly, even with our own kids, is to sit there and pretend when you see a misbehavior or something that may be going in the wrong direction, so you think, as long as it's not dangerous or harmful, just sit there and pretend that you're tied to the chair and imagine yourself untying yourself before you go over to redirect somebody, because often they'll redirect themselves, so that trust for the child. And it takes a little longer because you're only in there once a week. But also in my experience, like God's grace is there, so it does happen faster than you would think being there once a week, where in the classroom, sometimes it takes a little more strategizing. So I think that's a big one. But
yeah, and I think one of the things that's that you have some perspective on, Kath, is that, having been in, a traditional Montessori classroom where you have a 3-hour work cycle, you do get the chance very, most years fairly readily to be able to watch. You have the time to watch things naturally unfold, where in a once a week environment where you're there for an hour and a half or 2 hours, it takes a greater leap of faith, because you really don't have sometimes the visual evidence right away that you might if you're with the children for 30 hours a week. And Kath, maybe you want to tell that story talk about the idea of, so for those of you who have not been in in an environment where you've had the kids for 30 hours a week, like the importance of children spending time in the practical life area, or just learning how to navigate the classroom without the pressure of feeling like I've got to get all these lessons in right now. I thought you made a really great point when you were talking about that the other day.
Yeah. So I have heard a lot of catechists talking about, wanting to phase out practical life and the pressure that they feel to be making sure they're just involved in, the spiritual things of Jesus and all that. And I think that's beautiful. I think it comes when the time is right, and I just always think of what Dr. Montessori said in her London lectures. I've been pointing at the child and you've been staring at the end of my finger, like really looking at the child. And sometimes they need to sew a button for the entire time. And I think you can go back to, like, what did Our Lady do? What did she spend her time doing? It's okay for them to spend time in practical life and be engaged. And, sometimes if you're perceiving that they need to be invited to a lesson and they need to be, recommended some things, that is fine. It's different to me from wanting to phase out practical life. And in The Child of the Church, Dr. Montessori talks about, like, having them grow their own grapes for the wine. And, just recognizing that these things are holy also, and we want to make sure that we're presenting the catechesis lessons for sure, but also just remembering to trust the child.
I think, just if every CGS classroom had a portrait of St. Therese of Lisieux, to remind us that it's in the little things.
Yeah.
It's in those little things, those moments where a child is doing dry pouring. Through an adult perspective, we can see, you might overlay some of our own judgment on that it's almost a waste of time because we want to get to, to a lesson that speaks directly about Jesus. But Jesus was 3 too, and he was probably really interested in pouring beans as well. And so,
yeah, I agree. I think that if someone is wanting to remove practical life, they have a misunderstanding of the theological basis that can come from practical life, right? Because concentration leads to contemplation, which is prayer. And so they have just as much value in the atrium as all the other more theological presentations. I think that's a great point that you are making.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before, that concentration leads to contemplation. That's lovely. Yeah. I love how the Carmelites, their mugs have 2 handles because they put love into everything they're doing, And so just drinking coffee, which I put a lot of love into drinking coffee anyway. But these things can be, elevated to honor God, and can actually bring us closer to him.
And when we get back to Montessori philosophy, the ideal of normalization, which is, again, with such a short period of time, it's sometimes hard to see that start to manifest. I want to point out, hard to see it manifest, but it's probably manifesting more than folks realize it. That what normalization is that it's really taking away the roadblocks to a child's natural God-given development. And so something like practical life, or allowing the child to focus on something when the adult agenda when it conflicts with the adult agenda, is really, it does take a leap of faith, like nothing else. I'm going to tell this story. It's Kathy's story, but I love it, so I want to tell it. And that she had a little boy in her atrium last year who would come in and do, all he wanted to do was talk about Star Wars, right? And just come and just, that was his whole focus. And so rather than try to just control that and quote unquote redirect the child out of that, and this came from Kathy's years of experience in the classroom, she just sat down with him and started drawing Star Wars with him. And then you get to tell the rest of the story because it was your victory.
I don't remember the rest of the story, actually.
Well, remember, he started doing lessons.
He just started lessons. Yes, eventually. I think he needed to connect a little bit. And I was actually assisting in that room with someone who was a wonderful catechist, and she, she really loved him and accepted him as he was, and it wasn't long before, as soon as he felt connected with us, he was wanting the lessons, and the only avenue we had was to connect to him through Star Wars. Right. So, and you never know.
That's a great example. I love it. I actually had a very similar experience just this past week. I was in our Level One atrium, and I had 3 little boys who all wanted to do free art. And so I reminded them, okay, that's fine. And remember, whenever we do art in the atrium, we're going to draw pictures of things we see or feel or hear in the atrium. And one of the little boys told me, I'm going to draw what's in my head. And I was like, okay, go right ahead. And so he drew a picture of Darth Maul, so from Star Wars. And I was like, okay.
Star Wars.
But then him and I know, right? And then him and I went later, a little bit later, he wanted to do the Good Shepherd presentation. So I'm reading the scripture to him. He's already seen it. So I'm just reading the scripture. And he starts lining up the sheep and he's naming them. So he's moving in this moment. I'm watching that he has moved from sheep being sheep to sheep being people. I don't think he's gotten to the point where he is a sheep, but he's naming them. And one of the sheep is also Darth Maul. But I think
he can be redeemed too.
Yeah, right? Of course. I saw, though, in this progression in his atrium time that it's almost like he had to get Darth Maul out in the free art, and then he was able to, when I allowed him to do that, he was able to go deeper in the Good Shepherd presentation. So, yeah, that's really cool.
And if you come from a more traditional background, sometimes giving children that space and starting off by going with their energy and then redirecting it after you've made a connection and you've gained trust. It is, again, I've said it 2 or 3 times, but it's a little bit of a leap of faith, a trust in that what we're hoping for is actually it's already in the child, but it's our job to help clear away the pathway to allow that to unfold. And that tool that you both mentioned is one in Positive Discipline, which is the idea of connection before correction.
Yeah, and also the other one is just present warmth and because I was just thinking of that, of being truly present to who the child is, not who you want them to be or where you want to get. And that's been, in the philosophy of Catholic education forever. John Bosco talks about just being there and how so many of the problems with the boys were solved by just being present, and it's so true, especially in the 3 to 6 year old environment, and just being present and them knowing that you're there and that you care about them. They want to engage, they believe that there's something of interest in the materials in the atrium.
Yeah, and I just found out recently, interestingly, from a colleague who has just written a book on children with learning differences and disabilities, and we were talking about this idea of connection. And she ran across some research. I haven't put my eyes on it myself, but where they found that it is particularly imperative for boys to feel connected, even more so than girls, which would have, before I heard that, I would have said the opposite. And so for young boys to feel a sense of connection and trust with the adult is really critical. And, whenever I do a workshop, not I would say whenever, but many times when I do a workshop, I will sometimes bring people to the attention of, boys in the classroom. And I'll say, I want everybody to think of the child who you're having the most challenges with in your classroom right now. And then I ask, raise your hand if it's a boy. And usually 90% of the people raise their hand. And so it's bits of pieces of information like that it's even more important to connect with boys than and understanding that boys also connect differently and build relationships differently than young girls is also really, it's an important element to understand, especially because probably the majority of teachers of young children weren't boys.
Right.
It's a female dominated profession or vocation. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And so thinking about that positive discipline tool of connection before correction and knowing that boys need that more and differently. Okay, so then what would be some ways that I would connect with a boy differently than I would connect with a girl? Do you know?
Yeah. So a couple of simple examples. We were talking, we see this even with our daughter in terms of, with her interaction with me, and that is that boys connect really well through playing games. And that was when I was a 3 to 6 teacher. I used to connect with a lot of the boys through just, making something into a game. Even when we were outside, playing with them rather than just observing them and watching them. And also boys tend to connect really well when they're working side by side, and so do men. Like you'll notice a lot of times when men connect, they connect over an activity. And the analogy that I've heard is like it's the difference between walking side by side, which is how men tend to connect, versus face to face, which is how women, are more likely to connect. And so I think that doing work with boys, that example that you both gave of which is really what you both did with the Star Wars, is that you sat next to them symbolically, and you both had the experience where that bond started to get, created. And then I know did you want to throw anything in there, Kath?
No, I think that about sums it up.
Yeah.
I mean, just being respectful of the actual difference between boys and girls, I think is really important. And being willing to break out of your own comfort, like one of the things I wanted to bring up in this, it's another thing that Dr. Montessori said in the Child in the Church, is that the downfall of a teacher or a catechist or anybody, and she's talking about particularly, in the broad brush of any kind of a guide, is pride and anger, and I think that for women, sometimes, boys can push their buttons differently because we have this beautiful environment that is just lovely. And, we can almost hear the angels playing harps and stuff. And boys are going to approach that environment differently. And it's going to be lovely for them too. It's just going to be different. It's going, Star Wars is going to come into it sometimes, and just seeing that and appreciating how it gives glory to God. Because another John Bosco quote that I ran across recently was, something to the effect of run, play, and jump, but don't sin. And just recognizing, again, who the child is, rather than your own ideal of, how you think the room is going to be going.
Yeah. I'm a big, big fan of that quote from Montessori about us needing to have that examination of conscience and checking those sins of pride and anger before we enter the atrium. And Jana actually mentions it again in her book, Nurturing the Whole Child, and it's one of my favorites. I would love to hear about some of the key tools and principles behind positive discipline that you feel that could be applied well in an atrium setting. We've already said a few, like you talked about connection before correction and present, warm, and silence, and being kind and firm are some principles of positive discipline. What are some others?
So I think to expand on the idea of presence, warmth, and silence, to make that a little bit more concrete rather than philosophical, is important, because when I do workshops with teachers, is one of the first things that I after we talk about the big picture that I want to share with them, because probably the most common question that teachers ask, and parents really, and they ask it in 1,000 different ways, which is like, how do I get the kids to listen, right? How do I get them to follow through with what I'm asking them to do? And it's at the root of 75% of the questions. And so when we say presence, warmth, and silence, it sounds very ethereal, but really there's a very practical way to use that in the classroom. And so at the beginning, at the beginning of any school year, whether it's in the atrium or in a regular Montessori classroom, one of the first things that adults do is that they hopefully involve the children in setting the ground rules of the classroom, right? Or how they're going to navigate the classroom so everybody's treated with dignity and respect. And that would really be the first period. And hopefully the adults if they're rolling up mats, they teach children how to roll up a mat. They teach them how to walk around a mat, and just some of those essential key guidelines to navigating the classroom. How do you interrupt a teacher, like that? But limits aren't limits until they're tested. So, in a Montessori classroom, most of the materials are self-correcting, right? And which means that children are learning all day through making mistakes. But they maintain their dignity in that process because they correct those mistakes through the self-correcting materials. They don't have an adult over them nagging them saying, no, you need to put that there. Oh, that's too small. You need to put that there, right? And that's Montessori's idea of auto-education, where the child is learning through these self-correcting materials through trial and error, almost scientifically. But they do the same thing behaviorally. Right. So after they understand what the ground rules are, they're going to test those limits, and they test those limits because they want to know that the environment is secure. That just like there's order in the physical environment, and it's clear where you put the practical a pouring job back. The children are going to be looking for the same sense of consistency from the adults, and how the adults interact with children. So when they test the limits, what they're really asking is, did you mean what you say? Did you say what you mean? Are you going to be consistent so that I can gain my own independence and be able to predict with some sense of certainty what your reaction is going to be, so I can navigate this social environment with some security? So when adults, so really what a lot of times the adults are asking is that how do I follow through in a way that, how do you follow through that in a way that's kind and firm, at the same time? And what most of us come at that with, if we haven't had, the Montessori training or this positive discipline training, is we look at either kind or firm, right? So so in that case, a child, jumps over a mat, and you might just go give a gentle reminder, right? But if you're too gentle and it's all kindness with no firmness, the child may interpret that interaction as license to do it again. If you're too firm without the kindness, then you may be building distrust, and the child might engage then in sneaky behavior, or you might find yourself in a power struggle. So what I want to we'll share with you real quickly is what does that kindness and firmness look like in the moment when you have to follow through with a ground rule or a procedure that you have in the classroom. So what that really looks like is that adults, using Montessori's idea of that, we use the least words possible during a lesson or during interactions with the children, especially in the 3 to 6 age. So the least words possible, sufficient for the task. The idea here is that we use as few words, sometimes no words, and then we follow through with that with being completely present. So we don't leave the area, maybe after we've asked a child to roll up their mat. We stay right there for the full follow through. But we're also warm. I always call it just using a knowing smile, and essentially what you're trying to communicate with that knowing smile is, I know that you know. You know that I know, and I trust that you're going to follow through. And then, so we're warm, and then we're silent also. So if the child pushes back and says, well, that's not my mat, you just stay present, warm, and silent, and give them that knowing smile. I know that you know that I know, and I trust you're going to follow through. And the idea there is that, how many people does it take to engage in a power struggle, right? And we're not going to engage in the power struggle. We're just going to be what I call being a soft wall, right? We're a cement wall, but it's got a lot of padding on it. We're not going to move. We're not going to play whack-a-mole, but we're allowing the child to bounce up against us. But they're not going to get hurt because there's kindness in that interaction and there's warmth. But we're also going to be saying, oh, we're not going to move either. And so basically the adult uses as few words as possible. Maybe you can just point to the mat and smile and just stay there until they follow through. Or you might just say, hey, I noticed the mat's still on the floor. Or you might just give them a prompt with just saying one word, mat, and then smile and stay there. That tool was the one that really, changed the entire way I began to interact with children in the classroom. And Kath, you have a great experience with this as a 3 to 6 teacher, when the way that you used to interact with the children with your assistant and giving them that space. Maybe you want to share some of that.
Yeah. I think a lot of this stuff is actually right from the Absorbent Mind also, where it talks about maintaining that peace and being at peace yourself, rather than getting up, walking across the room and causing this wake of disruption behind you. One of the tools that I think I first learned when I was working at the school up in Maine was to just be, if the children didn't need a presentation or you didn't need to be directly with them, finding a place to sit and then just sort of filling the room with your presence. And it sounds weird, but just being fully there and fully engaged, but not interrupting them. And so just with that, I have often seen children on their way to interrupt another child working, or just sort of on their way to do something that they kind of know they shouldn't be doing, and they'll glance up and they'll see that you're there and that you're present, and often they'll smile back and return to what they were supposed to be doing. You've just avoided something that could kind of really disrupt the entire work cycle, so that discipline on the teacher's part of truly being there, but not letting your ego get in the way and feeling like you need to be needed or you need to be interacting or something, and just, feeling the warmth with your presence. One of the things, I've seen Chip do, observe and stuff like that, and he'll be saying his rosary or something like that, and so he's fully present, he's watching, and the children are settled, so just doing that and finding that piece to bring to the environment and receiving it back from the children.
That's awesome. I really enjoy that tool. I've been experimenting with it with my own children since reading about it in the book. And it's honestly, the opposite, of course, is nagging and repeating and using lots of words, and which causes my blood pressure to go up, right? My stress goes up by doing that. But doing the opposite of presence, warmth, and silence, it's keeping me calm. It's keeping the whole environment respectful and calm and peaceful. And that alone makes it a great tool. And it is very effective.
Right. And especially as a mother, you're the thermostat for the room quite often, so it changes everything.
And the kids feel like there's a difference, when you there's a real difference between just sitting on this edge of the room and like with your head down taking notes about what you think you should be taking notes about, and what Kath mentioned, which is filling the room with your presence. And because we can all go back to our childhood, we remember what it's like when the adult is fully present. It feels secure when somebody's watching, in a good way, not in an authoritarian way. And what's interesting is when you do that is to see, what Kath talked about, which is that the children self-correcting when they know that you're watching with warmth. And, I think that is just the truest display of, giving the child some dignity to make the decisions that they know themselves. And when you use that tool of presence, warmth, and silence, it's when you do know when the children know what's expected, and they know how to do what's being expected. And therefore you are just becoming the control of error, and they make those decisions for themselves, and they get the victory from that. It's not the adult's victory. You also avoid the trap of the adult moving through the room. If you ever want to see how that operates, when you're either doing an observation or set up a tripod in the corner of your room and watch what happens when an adult who's sometimes 3 times the size of a child moves across the room to go redirect the child. What we don't have is a rear view mirror, and you can see what happens in the wake when an adult moves through the classroom to go redirect that child. Not only is the adult not present because they're focused in on correcting that child, and again, sometimes you have to, right? But you're also walking with our big bodies past these small children who are engaged in something meaningful, and they immediately pick up their head, follow the adult to see the action that's going to happen. And we've actually participated in the disruption rather than helping sometimes.
I think that also goes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Kathleen, about imagining a rope untying around you before you get up. And I think that making sure that you give enough space. Honestly, I ask the Holy Spirit to guide me before I intervene, because a lot of times it's my pride and anger getting hit, and that's why I'm wanting to intervene. So by taking that 10 seconds to imagine the rope unraveling around me sitting in the chair, I think it gives that same dignity that the presence, form, and silence does that you're talking about, that you're allowing the child to have that self-correction, which a lot of times they do. If you would give them the space to, they will fix the problem most of the time. They will correct themselves. And I think it gives the same dignity that you were speaking into.
And the other magic that happens is that when the adult is is filling the room with their presence, if the other children feel it too. So if they see a peer starting to do something disruptive and they see that the adult is watching, they'll oftentimes step in and they'll say, "Hey, you've got to go back to your work," or we're not supposed to be doing that. And one of the questions I've asked myself many times is the reason that some of those older children aren't taking the lead, because is it simply because I never give them the chance, right? Because I'm too quick to step in. They don't need to. And it's amazing when you see some of those older children actually stepping in to redirect the child. It's beautiful. Everybody wins in that situation. The child gets a chance to express some leadership, and they feel good about contributing. And they're providing a model for the younger child, and the younger children love to listen to the older children. And sometimes the older children listen to the younger ones too.
That's awesome. Are there any other core tools that you would like to share?
Well, we can do just a quick short one before we end. Another favorite is probably the best of is what we call asking versus telling. In Positive Discipline, we refer to them as motivational curiosity questions. And I like to talk about this tool because it's a blind spot for me, actually. And whereas the presence, warmth, and silence is a good alternative to nagging and explaining, motivational curiosity questions are an alternative to giving directives. It's a real easy go-to because most of us grew up with adults who gave us directives. Go put on your coat. Come to circle. Clean up your work. Put your snack away. And what happens when we give directives is oftentimes is it puts the child in a situation, where it appears that they don't have any choices, but they really do. And the choices are I can comply or rebel. A colleague of mine calls it a dignity double bind because the bind is that the child is put in a position: do I comply with this directive or this command? And if I do, I'm going to give up. What I'm giving up is my dignity in this situation, right? But I'm going to maintain a relationship. Or do I rebel in an attempt to maintain my dignity and my own agency and personal power in this situation? But if I do that, then I'm going to harm our relationship. I'm going to harm that connection. And God made us hardwired to connect. We're intimately connected with with everything, but especially with each other. So And you always want to say is you never, if you give a command, it's almost as like asking a child a yes or no question. If you ask them a yes or no question, you better be prepared for the no and willing to accept it. Otherwise, it's a dishonest question. So what motivational curiosity questions do is it draws on things that the children already know, but instead of giving a reminder or a directive, what we're doing is we're prompting them to do what they already know how to do and cause them to think. So what these motivational curiosity questions are is instead of saying, go put your work away, say, what do you need to do to make sure that work is prepared for the next person who wants to use it? Right? And instead of saying, go put on your coat, you might say, what do you need to do to make sure that you're not cold outside? Or, hey, we walk in the classroom. And instead, you might say, how can you move in the classroom so that no one gets hurt? And so it's prompting the child to think. And normally those questions always start with a cheat on that is they're variations of really two questions. What do you need to do to fill in the blank? Or how would you go about doing that? So what do you need to do to make sure that your lunch doesn't get stepped on? Or how can you put away your lunch so that it doesn't get stepped on, like that. So and then you can use presence, warmth, and silence with that too, is you just stop talking after that and give them a knowing smile. And usually it doesn't invite the child there's no discussion needed, and the child isn't necessarily going to answer back. And maybe if you put yourself in the child's position as I was talking, you might have thought, even to yourself, thinking about what you needed to do. And I love that tool because it keeps the agency with the child. And it kind of conveys the fact that I do trust you. And people do better when they're trusted.
Yeah, I think along with that too is to recognize that these tools are a long game. So you might get some pushback from some of these questions, and that's fine. That's, goes back to what we were talking about, with just keeping your pride and anger in check. This is a long game and you can get pushback, but I think once you ride that out, you have a much stronger relationship with that child, with the classroom in general. So don't be discouraged if there is not immediate success in your view. There probably is success. It's just long term.
Yeah, and being careful of what works, because there's a lot of tools that we all have that work in the moment to control the situation. But to Cass' point, in the long game, also it might actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, like traditional discipline measures. They work in the moment for you to have discipline, but it doesn't mean that the child is actually growing or learning, right?
Yeah.
I appreciate that in your course, Chip, that you talked a lot about limits aren't limits unless they're tested. And it speaks into what y'all were just saying, because especially as a parent, but also as a catechist, it helped that pride not get hit when the limits are tested. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to test limits, and it's my job as the adult to hold kindness and firmness within the testing of those limits. And that was very real, because that happens, and it helped me respond in a more compassionate, dignified, and dignity for the child way when those limits are tested.
Yeah, and you feel better about the relationship. There's we talk about in our book that, people do better when they feel better, which, overall is fairly true. But that's not just true for children. It's true for adults. When we're treating people with dignity and respect and being effective, we feel better. And when we feel better, we do better also.
Yes, right. And then there's that Dreykus quote of a misbehaving child is a discouraged child. It goes right with that. I just love that. Yeah. Okay, so so many amazing things, and I feel like we barely scraped the surface of all the awesomeness that positive discipline brings to our table, specifically within Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So what are some resources that you would point people to if they want to learn more?
Well, Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom is the book.
It's a great book.
Yeah.
It's my favorite book.
It is a great book.
Better than Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. I think it's right up there with J.R. Tolkien. So. It's got murder, romance,
everything you could want.
But So obviously we wrote the book specifically for a Montessori environment. So I think that certainly is a good start. There are resources on our website. Monthly we'll put out an article, a fairly in-depth article, tackling one specific misbehavior each month, and different ways that you can look at that and address it. And you could get to our website, and it's PDMC, standing for Positive Discipline and Montessori Classroom. So PDMC-Montessori.org. And there's quite a few resources there for people to look at, and they're free and accessible to everyone.
Right. I would agree. I am a big fan. The Positive Discipline, Jay Nelson's books are amazing, and they really go into the general philosophy, and I've enjoyed that as a resource also. But I appreciated your book specific with the tilt of the Montessori angle, because I felt, even though the examples were about a Montessori classroom, it's very easy to see how that could live within the atrium environment as well. And so I feel so much more prepared as a catechist this year after having read the book and then doing the online course that we did over the summer. And I agree, your newsletters are amazing. They have a lot of continuing resources there. So I'll put some links in our show notes for those things if anybody wants to check those out and continue to learn about this.
Well, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to meet you, actually. I've never talked to you before.
Yeah. It was really great to talk to you both. I appreciate your work, and I appreciate you sharing with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Carrie.
you.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. In our show notes, I have a bunch of resources there to help you continue to explore this subject of positive discipline, starting with the book Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom by Chip DeLorenzo and Jane Nelson. You can purchase that through the link on our show notes that takes you to Amazon. You can also purchase that book from Montessori Services. I also put a link for the Positive Discipline in the Montessori Classroom website, where you can access a whole bunch of news articles that really dive into a lot of topics within positive discipline. And you can also register for the online Positive Discipline in the Montessori course. And if you choose to register, we ask that you indicate that CGS is your group affiliation. There is also a link for positivediscipline.com, which also has a whole bunch of different books and resources available to you there as well. I went ahead and put links to a whole bunch of podcast episodes that we have had that circle around this theme of freedom and discipline, freedom and limits. Also in our show notes, there is a link for becoming a member of CGS USA. There are many benefits to becoming a member. One of those is that you get access to the virtual songbook. This is a page on our website behind the members only section that has dozens and dozens of videos of catechists and formation leaders singing songs that you can sing in your atrium with children on all the different themes throughout the year. Another benefit to becoming a CGS USA member is our annual journal. So this is a journal that gets mailed out to all of our members every fall. And if you are currently a member of CGS USA, look in your mailboxes, because you should be getting the annual journal anytime now. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. We would like to thank all of our contributing members, because you are making this podcast possible. If you would like to know more about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.